grounds on this topic, I think we can all agree on the fact that we need to act now. Because countries are not respecting climate targets, they are not doing enough, funds are being wasted, and millions of people are dying and being displaced. Therefore, at this point, enforcement is mandatory. Now, clarifying some parts of the motion, climate targets are set by international organizations such as the European Union. Therefore, this sanction will also be imposed by them. They will be regulated and democratically defined by member countries. Now, these targets need to set the global goal, but generally they also have to keep into consideration the local situations as well, because this means that they state that global emissions need to go down by 40%, but they also state that the USA and Nigeria have different responsibility when it comes to their actions. Another characterization is that these organizations generally also provide developing nations with funds in order to achieve the goals. Taking the European Union as an example, it requires developing nations to only gradually reduce their emissions. Thank you. And it provides them with funding when it comes to acquiring, for example, sustainable technologies, etc. So why are we talking about sanctions specifically? Because enforcement has become a priority, and we can see from the status quo that relying on voluntary collaboration is not enough anymore at the moment. But the point is that we need to act now to fight an issue such dangerous and threatening as climate change is.
So you're taking away money from them to then give them back money. What sense does that make?
We're actually helping them to reach the target that they have to reach. And the sanction is there as an incentive. We will tell you later on in our arguments why the sanction is crucial because it is an incentive. So I was talking about sanctions. Thank you. Sanctions are. I'm talking about sanctions specifically because enforcement has become a priority. This was the first reason. The second reason is because strengthening the economy of a country is the most efficient way to incentivize compliance, as no country wants to lose profit, of course. So these sanctions will be applied by the organization, and they can be withdrawn in the moment in which the country shows collaboration. So what is our burden in this debate? Our burden is to prove to you that we are able to fight climate change in the most efficient and easy and fastest way. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that through our two arguments. The first one being on the fact that it incentivizes compliance, and the second one being on the fact that it guarantees cooperation between countries. Let's begin with the first one. It incentivizes compliance. We tell you that having to meet climate targets with the consequence of international sanctions incentivizes compliance both of developed countries and of developing countries as well. Why is that? But nowadays, countries don't face any type of repercussions when it comes to not complying with the regulations.
Why should we think these sanctions would work if, for example, sanctions on Russia in the Ukraine-Russia war are totally ineffective?
We're going to put that later on in this debate. Why is that? I was talking about how nowadays countries don't face any type of repercussions when it comes to not complying with the regulations. Therefore, they have no incentive, because they have no incentive in doing it. Because if they were to comply, they would lose profit. And of course, if they need to choose between being environmentally sustainable and lose profit, or they have to choose, the other option is gain profit or be environmentally unsustainable, they of course are going to choose this option because it's the most profitable one. So as economy, thank you. So as economy has a crucial role in a country's well-being, the most peaceful and effective way to oblige a country to comply with targets that are imposed is by threatening their economy. So on our side, countries choose to comply because what they would lose is bigger than what they would gain by not complying. So then what about developing countries? No, thank you. Developing countries will have an incentive too. Well, right now, developing countries have no incentive in being environmentally sustainable because it is expensive. It requires a lot of means, a lot of money. They simply are not incentivized in doing it. But we give them an incentive, and the incentive are the sanctions. And of course, they will also be helped as the targets that they would have to reach are proportional to every country's necessities and every country's emissions too. So they would be able to comply, and the incentive they have to comply are the sanctions. So now that we have mechanized how every country would be able to comply, we have wanted that there will be also a better investment of funds. Because when an international organization sets a target that needs to be reached, it sets also some funding directly to the nations. And right now, these funds are not being used to achieve the goals, because as mentioned before, countries are not incentivized in achieving them, so these funds are simply wasted. But since in our world the countries are incentivized, and we have mechanized this before, these funds will be used to help them, and they will be better invested. So which are the impacts we're going to access here? More compliance and benefits that will be gained from the funds, and these two impacts are going to result in a better situation to fight against climate change. So at the end, what we are proposing is the closest thing that will help us the most to tackle climate change. Thank you.
Speech 6 minutes, 44 seconds.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, everyone. I'm Carlo Ciletti, first speaker of opposition. And in my speech, you can expect a first phase of rebuttal. Then we will present our counter context, our counter model, and finally, we will present the first of our 3 points in our team line. Let's start by rebutting what first proposition said. First of all, she talked about giving countries funding. After sanctioning them, you give them fundings. We also tried to ask a POI on it, and they said it is to help the country to transition. Well, nothing would actually change. If you take away money from a country, and then you decide simply to give it back immediately later, what actually happened? You would be just taking away the sovereignty from that single country because you wouldn't be enforcing them how to spend the money. But that's not in the liberty of freedom that we believe in. Oh, then they talked about their first point, which was incentivize compliance. Their second people will talk about cooperation. It incentivized compliance, and we asked the POI on Russia. Why do sanctions on Russia not really work in the Russia-Ukraine war? Nothing has really changed. We still have not found peace. And there was totally no response. I have to say, it's a good decision because there is actually no response. I mean, sanctions are ineffective. They have been demonstrated throughout history again and again and again that sanctions are ineffective. They never work and they never reach the final goal. Sanctions never help. The only way is incentivizing them. You cannot, punishment never works. And they also said that if you threaten them of damaging their economy, they would mandatorily comply. But do you really believe that a few sanctions on especially certain countries would really make a difference? The fossil fuel business is worth $7 trillion globally, according to IMF. And this is a huge market. How can a few sanctions on countries I'm thinking about huge fossil fuel countries. For example, Saudi Arabia will make a difference. They will simply boost their fossil fuel production to compensate the sanctions that are being imposed. And instead, if they're a poor country, they will simply receive the sanction and have two choices: or live in poverty because they don't have any more money to do the transition, or decide to boost their industries to then produce even more fossil fuels, pollute even more, and the result is we have solved nothing. Now let's pass to our context. And in our world, punishment has never worked. As I said in the rebuttal, let's think about Russia in the war. There are many sanctions against them, but do they actually care about those sanctions? Absolutely not. Nothing has changed in the Ukraine war because Russia simply ignores those sanctions. And instead, what if we give sanctions to a country that doesn't have the means to fight those sanctions? They have two options: or fall into poverty, or boost their pollution industry to sustain those sanctions. So it would even discourage transition. It would have the completely opposite effect if we do what proposition is proposing. And what would that have on effects on international cooperation? Most countries, countries do actually pollute more than they should. This means that they will all receive sanctions, making sanctions ineffective, because if everyone sanctions, in the end no one has sanctions, and it will simply worsen international cooperation and relationships because everyone is sanctioning each other. And this gives me a chance to present our counter model to solve this issue. Because as we said, punishment never works. So instead of punishment, these countries need help, especially the countries that don't have the means to transition. Let's help them. How can we help them? We would send experts to give them effective tools to transition, the knowledge to know how to transition. We can give them loans, no thank you, from the World Bank. And we could also help them by giving them investment funds, because many investment funds want to invest into transition, and we will explain now why. So why should they transition? Because the countries that are polluting, no thank you, polluting right now, would invest in their future, because because investments are moving from oil industry to more eco-friendly alternatives. This is our future. So by transitioning, these countries will be moving to the economy of the future, because or there's no future because we all die because we don't transition, or the future is this: it's eco-friendly green. So if there's no future, there's no economic gain. So this is why they will want to transition. People will have better quality of life, so more jobs and less pollution, and also better quality of life for pollution. Countries would have extreme long-term benefits because they have invested in the future, and our planet will effectively become green. So why have they still not done it? Countries now prioritize short-term solutions, but by helping them with the experts in financing, they will finally have the tools for long-term solutions. We're giving them the tools to decide to put aside short-term solutions and find long-term solutions. I will accept the now.
Are you aware of the fact that your counter model is literally the status quo? The organizations are giving them funds right now, and it is not working because they are wasted, because they're not well invested.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much for the POI. The thing is, this is not status quo because they're not well applying this model. We have to boost these investments, and we want to give them a chance to transition by boosting this plan. Anyway, let's pass to our team line, which is made of 3 points. The first one is that we would just pollute more. The second point is it would worsen the international relations. And our third point is that it would disadvantage countries that don't have the means. So, let's talk about the first point. We would just pollute more. Because as you said, in our counter context and model, if we punish a country because of their inaction, you wouldn't be concretely solving anything. And why is this? Because there can be two possible reactions in this situation. For a country with money and the means to sustain these sanctions, they will totally ignore these sanctions because they can perfectly pay them, just for example in the case of Russia. And they will continue polluting as if nothing happened. Or even worse, they could even boost their pollution because to pay those sanctions, they would boost these industries of oil production. Also because their public image wouldn't even be hit that much, because 80% of the countries that have, for example, signed the Paris Agreement are not really respecting the terms. So we're talking about 4/5 of the countries in the world would receive these sanctions. These are very ineffective sanctions. They wouldn't really hit their public image because everyone is being sanctioned. Instead, if a country without the means to transition would receive their sanctions, they obviously cannot ignore those sanctions because their economy would be deeply hit and they would have terrible consequences. So they can have two possible reactions. First reaction, they decide to do nothing because they don't have money anymore. They don't have the money to transition, and so they decide simply to accept their condition of eternal poverty. Or if not, the second reaction could be that they invest more money into oil consumption, oil production, and their industries polluting even more. So this would have the opposite effects, but not because these poor countries are evil, but because they have to sustain the sanctions that proposition want to propose. So what is the impact? By doing what proposition is proposing, we would inevitably have an inverse effect. Or a country, if it has the money, can ignore the sanction, or if a country is poor, it will go into eternal poverty, or it will pollute even more to try to sustain the issue of those sanctions. And people would inevitably become or poorer, or if not, they will start living in even more pollution because of the conditions created by the countries. So to recap, we're strongly in favor of the motion because we would just pollute more, and it disadvantages countries that don't have the means, and it will worsen the international relations. Thank you very much for listening.
Second speaker, opposition side. You ready?
I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, dear judges. Before starting with our second and last argumentation, I would like to start with a rebuttal of what the first speaker of the opposition team has stated. So, first of all, I would like to start with the POI that has been asked and tackled multiple times, is that why sanctions will work. The opposition is trying to push a narrative in which we are not able to actually go and have some tangible effects with the sanctions on the environmental crisis. And multiple times they have tackled with the Russia example. What we're trying to tell you is because that we will later on explain even more better with some examples in the second argumentation, is that economies are interconnected, okay? This will be tackled in the second argumentation, so I will not be able to tackle it in the rebuttal. But what we're trying to tell you is that the sanctions will work because once the economy is threatened, they will actually be able to cooperate. And the Russia example is actually a proof of what we're trying to tell you that we'll later explain better, is the Russian war with Ukraine has brought to many increases in European countries all over the world because of what's happening. And also, their model consists basically in telling us that the punishment never works. But as we will show you later with the second argumentation, because we actually brought a tangible study case, where we're trying to explain you that actually punishment works with the Mercosur example that we will later tackle. They're basically defending the status quo, which is, yes, their part, but what they're telling us is that we will give them more funds, the punishment does not work because it has never worked, and the funds we'll be giving them are going to be even more. But the fact is, the problem is we're discussing this motion because we're trying to tell you that this does not work in the status quo. Every country that signs, for example, agreements does not follow up those things that they have signed for. Enforcement is necessary, and we have told you multiple times during the first
speech. And about the boost plan. So basically they're telling us that once sanctions are being imposed to the countries, the thing that we will be doing, especially the developed countries, is going to be, that they will boost even more their, for example, economies, because they will actually try to sell more the oil or whatever it is to go and actually afford those sanctions. But what we're telling you is that that's not possible, because we're talking about international sanctions. If it's international sanctions, means that the countries cannot collaborate with those countries, so they will be not able to actually pay and afford those sanctions. What we're trying to tell you, that because these countries are so economically involved with each other, we're trying to tell you that we will collaborate, and the sanctions actually are needed. And about the developing countries and the impact that they bring on them, they're telling that, first of all, they will be not able to do anything, or they're not going to be doing anything, and they invest in consumption of even like causing more pollution. But actually, sanctions will help them, and we will explain this better in the second argumentation. We thought we will pass to the second argumentation, that is about how the sanctions will help countries collaborate with each other. We show you how sanctions on international level would improve international cooperation between nations that are involved. So let me make it clear to you by showing you a case study, because what we're telling you might sound utopical, but we will explain this with a case study, that is the Mercosur free trading agreement. In the last few years, in fact, the EU has worked hardly on a free trade agreement with South America. The trade briefly consists in EU free trading with the South American nations only if their products did not harm the environment. What we're trying to tell you is that the EU literally threatened to remove the trade agreement if they did not meet up with their and comply with their requirements and their regulations. And what was the reaction of these countries? You will be asking yourself. Some of the nations, such as Bolivia and Paraguay, actually were not, in the first place, convinced with these tradings, because they thought that it would bring them no profit, they wouldn't be gaining anything. But what it happened instead, it was that they soon realized that by signing and following the regulation, it would bring even more harm to their nations and to their economies. Why? Well, because their economies would have been repressed, because they wouldn't be able to actually collaborate with the EU anymore. One second. And they would have also hurt the South Americans' economy, because as we were telling you, economies are strictly connected to each other. So tell me.
So this is a great opportunity to tell us why your sanctions will work and instead Russian sanctions don't.
We're telling you that, first of all, the Russian sanctions were because they are in war and not because of environmental change. Okay. Second of all, the sanctions they did not work with Russia because the situation was completely different, because the levels are different, because one we are talking about the environmental, and then there's the human rights. I will explain that later, okay? What we're trying to tell you, okay, so it would have been to a more harmful situation. Because by not, in fact, trading with the EU economies, they would have been even more hurt, because when their economy was hurt, they wouldn't be able to work with the EU, but also with the other countries, because their economy couldn't literally afford to work with other nations. So at the end, they choose deliberately to collaborate and support theirs and others' economy because they collaborated. And since the agreement were enforced, millions of trees in Brazil were saved and planted, and intensive farming has been decreased. And these are just some of the impacts, tangible impact that is brought. All of these proves our point. First of all, economies are interconnected. B, the nations will give up their own profit so they don't harm theirs and each other's economy, so cooperating. And at the end, the benefits will be from both sides. And the impact is by following our model and imposing sanctions on nations that fail to actually meet these environmental targets. We will not only be able to make nations cooperate with each other, but also we have shown you that with, for example, Mercosur trading agreement that will bring to actual, tangible effects and changes. So on the comparative side, the opposition has no incentive to follow up the environmental targets because they're not imposing sanctions, and there is no collaboration between the countries, and there is not actual impact on the environment. But on our side, we're telling you that if it incentivizes them by putting the tensions, it brings to more collaboration and brings to tangible effects. Thank you.
Second speaker on the opposition side.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Today, as second speaker of opposition team, I'm here to make things clear for everyone, for judges and for proposition team. And I will do this throughout 2 different parts of my speech. The first part, where I go to refute everything of what proposition brought to us, their plan, and how would they enact their plan, that actually isn't really clear to us. And second, but throughout the explanation of our second and third point of our team line. So let's follow me in a really big question, because here today we want to help both sides, we want to help who doesn't respect climate targets. And so we ask proposition, how are we going to help countries that do not respect climate targets? And they said, giving them sanctions, removing them money. Do you really think that this is the right way to follow? This is the right road to go further? It isn't. Because we can agree that developing countries, that are the countries that usually can't achieve climate targets, don't have unlimited money also to pay those sanctions they are proposing. For example, let's take the case of India or African countries more in general, such as Nigeria. The development of sectors such as energy, transport, and industry is essential to get out of poverty. So you're imposing sanctions to countries that didn't achieve the targets that you or the UN or association in general stated because they don't have money. So they will never achieve this. You're removing money to people that don't have money. And this is completely wrong to countries that don't have money. No, thank you. I don't take your right. So with our plan, we're not only talking about money and stuff like this. We're talking about giving them concrete things, giving them experts, giving them investment funds. And we boost, and we can actually have the power as opposition to boost the status quo, to let the status quo, let it become a better condition, a better scenario. And then we simply ask it to proposition, how does your plan work? Or in other words, as you prefer, how are sanction effective if there are clear examples, and we brought you examples such as Russia-Ukrainian conflict that shows that the sanctions doesn't work. And they simply said, we will respond it later, and then they, again, we repeated the same things. We will go through after this point. And this is completely wrong, because probably they don't have an answer to this. Probably there is no answer, because this is actually our value. Punishment doesn't work and will never work. Because we can't punish someone that is failing. We have to help him to do better. We have to help him to achieve a target. And without cutting his arms or his legs. We have to give him the possibility to do better. And we opposition are here to do this. Punishment doesn't work, and it creates sanctions, it creates tensions. For example, just think to the case of US that just imposed a lot of tariffs to China, Europe, and all the world more in general. What this created to all the world, all the countries that are part of our loss of millions, billions actually, and then protest. All the roads were full of people that were against what they did, against this punishment, against this loss of billions of dollars, and then disadvantages for all. For example, a really big increase in simple things such as meat or primary product that we all need to live. And this scenario is a terrible scenario. It's a scenario that can easily happen if you follow the road, if we follow the punishment road. And that's exactly why we're here. And to demonstrate to you, we brought you 3 different points. First, we will just pollute more. Second, it would worsen international relations. And third, disadvantages countries that don't have money. It's my honor now to analyze from top to bottom my second and third point. Let's start with the second one. It worsens international relations. Let's be clear under this point. What are international relations? The will that a state has to collaborate with another state to solve a common problem, a problem that both states have at the same time. And why are international relations important? Because are the only way to solve a global problem, a common problem, throughout cooperation, through cooperation. And why are the only way then? That's the real question. Why are the only way to solve global problems? Because states, by their own, don't go anywhere. For example, USA just signed out the Paris Agreement and now is polluting more. It's going against what they did before. Running all the international relations and running the efforts of every country. No, thank you. So why this motion ruins international relations? Because if I steal a piece of your snack during the break, tomorrow you won't share with me your snack as you usually did. As the same way, let's be clear on this, as the same way, if the UN imposes sanctions, all the states will not cooperate anymore with each other, and their trade will be worse, leading to a significantly worsening in our planet, in our world. In cooperation, we will never listen again the word cooperation. And this will all lead to a fail in the green transition, to a fail for a better future, a green future for everyone. And so this shows again how is this bad. Our global problem can't be simply solved by a lot of single solutions. We need something more. We need something for everyone that can solve a common problem. And this is our plan, our luminary and new plan, because we want something different. We want to push the idea that punishment doesn't work. So this leads actually to our third and last point of our timeline. In fact, it is disadvantages countries that don't have the means to obviously to take part of the agenda, to join the climate change resolution. In fact, by sanctioning every single country that doesn't meet climate targets, would disadvantage all the other countries that didn't achieve it, not because they don't care about climate, let's really clear under this point, or have other interests such as economical interests, but all the countries that don't even have the means to fight climate change, such as all the developing countries. And by sanctioning developing countries such as Nigeria, Kenya or Sudan, these countries we will simply make their condition even worse than how it is in this moment. They actually need money to fight and try to become green. And we will create a system by sanctioning them of disadvantages, because let's take this simple example. A developing country don't reach the target, and then in their world it got sanctioned. And then, again, it will always less money to pay the sanctions, and it will fail again and again and again, getting fined and getting sanctioned again and again and again. And in this way, we are literally destroying a country, and even the worst, if we want to act for the common good, how can we think to leave behind some countries? How can we think to leave behind a part of our world if we want to save the world? So what's the impact? A world of disparities and a clear division between countries, showing again how punishment, how our value never work. And as in another statement, this shows this is actually that disadvantages countries that don't have the means that I just explained it to you. And with this, I want to remind you that we are proudly against the motion, because we clearly believe that the word that the proposition is pushing doesn't work, because they are pushing punishment. That punishment doesn't work, never. Thank you.
opposition, you can expect things from my speech. First of all, some clarifications on framework, then I'll move on to the main clashes in this round and show you why side proposition is currently winning on those clashes. And then finally, I'll move on to the weighing and show you why, even if you don't think that we're winning, what we bring to the table weighs more than what side opposition brings. But let's start with one quick thing on framework. Because side opposition completely misunderstands the concept of fundings that we bring in our first speech, right? What do we tell you? We tell you that right now, the same organizations that would be putting on the sanctions are providing developing nations with fundings. Why is that? Because they set the targets, right? And these targets are gradually and adapt to the local situation of the developing nations. That means that China will not have to meet the same targets that Bangladesh needs to meet. That India will not have the same targets that the US needs to meet, right? They are proportionate to the country that they are handling. And then B, that these organizations take into account the local situation. That means that if they know that a developing nation is not able to achieve those goals without the help, they aid them with the fundings. We are able to prove this also with evidence by talking to you about the fundings that the EU has provided to developing nations. No, thank you. And with the example of the EU working in Bolivia, in Paraguay, in the whole area of South America and Mercosur, in order to help them develop their agricultural sector in a way that doesn't lead to deforestation. No, thank you. But then what is the difference and why am I clarifying this in framework? Because in opposition, the main difference is that these funds are being wasted in developing nations. Why is that? It is because there is no incentives to comply with the regulations. The developing nations have to face a choice inside opposition, right? They can either invest those fundings in order to produce more and gain a profit, or they can invest them in order to be environmentally sustainable. Insofar as they face no repercussions if they are not environmentally sustainable, then they choose to invest them elsewhere. On our side of the house, instead, they are obliged to invest them, or at least incentivized to invest them in an environmentally sustainable way, because if they don't do so, then they face repercussions, right? So you see how this consequence incentivizes them to comply. But then, having cleared this up on framework, let's move on to the first point of clash, which is on efficiency of the sanctions. What does side opposition tell us? They tell us two main things. That our sanctions will not work because A, they can be ignored, and because B, developing nations wouldn't be able to sustain the sanctions. Let's tackle the first point first. On the first point, let me point out that they don't really ever mechanize why these sanctions wouldn't work. They just bring the example of Russia. Bringing an example is not a mechanization. This is not enough on their part. But let me respond to their example anyway, right? We tell you that the Russia example doesn't work because it is a totally different situation. No, thank you. Let's do some incentive analysis to show you the difference. What happened in Russia was that they had an incentive to ignore them. What was that? That they could go on and benefit immensely from the war. Look at the situation right now, right? They gained the benefit from going on with the war, with the deal they just signed. Instead, they had another incentive to comply with the sanctions. And what would that lead is that they could lose some profit, but they could still trade with other countries. So when you weigh those two incentives, you see why Russia chose to ignore the sanctions, because they would profit more from ignoring them. No, thank you. Instead, when it comes to climate change, the incentives to comply completely outweigh, because what you gain from being environmentally not sustainable is not more than what you gain, than what you lose if you get sanctioned. In the case of Russia, they gained more by accepting the sanctions and going on with the war. In the case of environmental sustainability, you don't gain more if you get those sanctions. You actually lose more. Therefore, you choose to comply with the regulations. But then B, even if you don't buy this mechanization, we take them at their highest ground and we engage and we tell you that the only countries that would be able to ignore these sanctions anyway are the most powerful countries, right? So the US, maybe China, maybe Russia. But we tell you that in the top six countries that pollutes more, what countries do we find? We find India, we find Indonesia, we find developing nations, we find Bangladesh. We tell you that all of these countries do not have the resources to simply ignore sanctions like Russia did. So this means that these countries have no incentives and no way to ignore the sanctions. And if they're not able to ignore the sanctions, then they choose to comply with the regulations in order not to get sanctioned, right? And if India, Bangladesh, Indonesia comply with the regulations, then we benefit so much, because now they're able not to pollute as much as they do. We tell you that 3 of the 6 most polluted countries are gonna reduce their emissions and and therefore we still gain all of the benefits
POC.
on climate change. No, thank you. But then, on their second point on efficiency, which is on developing nations instead, they told us that developing nations will not be able to bear the cost of these sanctions and to get to those goals in the first place. We empirically disprove this, their point, because we tell you that that developing nations can achieve those goals. Why is that? Because the goals are set in order for them to achieve. We're not asking them, no thank you, we're not asking them to achieve the impossible. We're giving them the funds and the resources to achieve those goals, and we're asking them to invest them in the right way in order for them to invest them. If the embargoes are imposed by the EU members can simply ignore the sanctions. Then that means that on probability, developing nations that now have the means and the resources to comply with the regulation choose to comply because they don't want to stop trading with the EU. Let me remind you, as I said, that the 27 countries of the EU can simply ignore the sanctions imposed by the EU, like we bring in our model. Maybe Russia can. Those 27 countries don't. Developing nations will choose to comply. But then, last thing on this clash, it's the comparative. Because what is their comparative, right? Their comparative is literally the status quo. They just tell you, oh, we're going to bring experts into those countries. We're going to give them resources. A, we give them resources on our side. 2, this is not enough. We need to give them an incentive to comply with the regulations. Because otherwise, we will never solve climate change. And if we don't solve climate change, then people are dying. No, thank you, not yet. But then, their model is not even exclusive, right? Because we tell you that we can send those people in this country even on our side, that we can invest those funds even on our side. We actually do it. And we can also have the incentive. Last thing, their model may work in developing nations, but how does it work in developed nations? Are you going to send experts in the US and will that convince them to not pollute anymore? The US has experts and it has not convinced them. We need to give them an economic incentive. Before I move on, I will take a point.
You lost your chance.
No, it's 6.3. Okay, no point. So then, second clash, collaboration. What does side opposition tell us? They tell us that countries don't collaborate anymore because when one country sanctions the other, then a tariff war happens, and without collaboration, the green transition is basically impossible, right? What do we tell you? We tell you that it is highly unlikely that the market will face as big of an impact as they claim because tariff wars impact negatively every other country. And so, if the countries have an alternative, they will most probably choose the alternative to tariff war. B, we tell you that we provide countries with an alternative. We tell you that complying with the regulations, and mind you that these targets are not impossible to achieve, as I already told you. Therefore, we tell you that countries will probably choose to comply because we're giving them an alternative to tariff war. Because A, sanctions would harm them more than what they gain from being environmentally sustainable, right? For example, if I produce meat with intensive farming, I gain something. But then if I have to pay the sanctions, I lose way more than what I'm gaining from using intensive farming. So I choose to comply with the regulations. We flip their side with our third argument that went unresponded on how economies are interconnected and therefore I don't want other countries to be sanctioned. I held them out. We actually boost collaboration between countries. Choose side of proposition. Thank you.
Dear panel, first of all, we want to thank the third proposition speaker for the very energetic speech. And through that, we clearly understand that throughout the whole 24 minutes of proposition case, they are trying to push us are a lie. That's nothing but a lie, because the world that they try to mechanize, the world that try to bribe us today is just about fighting under the rug, things that don't actually work how they are. They are just ignoring everything that we said right now, and they just completely ignore that and keep pushing on their side without actually engaging in our point. But enough of that, all of this is gonna clearly match on the two biggest clash points that occurred in this debate. First of all, what is the solution that we should implement to solve the problems that today is happening? Because, of course, the climate change is a problem, we recognize it. And also how the country will respond to these solutions and what will this cause for the environment. So let's start with the first biggest clash point of today's debate. There's lots of different things to say from this, and I want to start from the model that the proposition brought us today. They brought us a model, and here I start the first speaker proposition, where the climate target is imposed by UN, and the UN is gonna enforce those, no thank you, UN is gonna enforce those sanctions. Two things on that. First of all, they never truly said what are those sanctions about. They never defined sanctions. They never said if those are just trade-off exclusive or maybe monetary sanctions, no thank you, where they are actually going to take the money from the countries. They never said that. Besides that, how can the UN enforce those sanctions? Because UN doesn't have the power to enforce any sanctions, because UN itself doesn't have any commercial with those countries. The only things that UN can do is propose to the countries that are inside of the UN to impose those sanctions. But this would mean that the countries in the UN would impose those sanctions on themselves, which is completely absurd. They will never ever do this, because of course it's against their economy. It's something that they're not willing to do this, because as we said many times, doesn't actually give them any revenue. The whole model that they brought to us was completely flawed, because they didn't really mechanize this. They didn't explain to us what are those sanctions, and they didn't really explain how the UN is going to enforce those sanctions. If the UN doesn't actually have the power to enforce anything, because it doesn't have any trade-off, any commercial with any of the countries. Also, they also said that they will impose those sanctions because essentially punishment is the only thing that can work with the countries. This is completely absurd. This is completely false, and we demonstrated you many times this. We actually mechanized this, and we said it because if to a country is more convenient to just pay the fines that they may be induced on those countries, even if they didn't really clarify that, it would be more convenient than just changing. We brought the example of Russia, which is the biggest example. They didn't really explain that. They just said, oh, you know, but that's a different topic. So let's talk about their topic. The second speaker of the proposition team stated that some of those sanctions have already been tried to be implemented, and they brought the exact example of Brazil. They said, just a second, that in Brazil, they said that if they didn't stop cutting down the trees, they would have a trade-off reduction with the different countries. And they said that they claim that it works. But if it actually works, then why is it that Brazil economy still today is completely based on cutting down trees, on cutting down the Amazon forest? Because this is what the Brazil economy is still based on. And this clearly demonstrates that the mechanization is flawed and doesn't really add anything to this debate. Yes?
Let's say that Russia is able to ignore those sanctions. Can you engage with the fact that most countries will not be able to do it? And therefore,
thank you very much. I
respect
completely
their
understand your
traditions?
point. Of course, there are some countries that are able, and there are some countries that are not able, and we clearly demonstrated you with our model. And the first point of our team was all about this. There are some countries that I'm going to explain this also later in the second clash point. But there are some countries that would just ignore the sanctions, as Russia did, and as even Brazil, which is not, which doesn't really a great economy, actually did anyway. And the countries that won't be able to ignore the tariff will just find the money to pay those tariffs on the industry that they are investing right now, which is the industry of pollution, which will just cause even more pollution in today's world. So, no, thank you. Instead, we propose to you a model that actually works. And this isn't only just about the status quo. It's about implementing it and enhancing it. And we said many times that, yes, you're right, sometimes not always those countries are using the funds that they are given. And of course, we brought you the model. In our model, we solved these issues, saying that first of all, we will give more aids, and also we will incentivize the countries to accept those aids and use them for the right things by giving them trade-off benefits with the different countries. So if a country accept those aids and made the green transition, it will have benefits, trade-off commercial benefits from other countries. And that's why the countries will actually accept this model and will actually make the green transition in our world where there's no punishment, but actually there are incentivized. They are incentivized to do this because in our world it is actually economical, convenient for them. Instead, in their world will be just a trade-off that they won't be willing to accept. So now, enough of this, let's talk about the country response, which is the direct consequence of the first clash point. How the countries will respond to these plans. On proposition side, the countries, we clearly explain this in the first and the third argument. The countries will stop collaborating between themselves because with these sanctions, those sanctions are made, as you said, to limit the trade-offs between the different countries. And if the commercial trade-offs are limited between different countries, also the ecological trade-offs and the ecological collaboration between countries that help each other to make this green transition would fall off. There wouldn't be any more cooperation because those sanctions wouldn't only impact the economy of the countries, but also the collaboration on all the other aspects. For example, the green transitions. So this will ruin all the different and very complex global international relations that are today. That today the different countries are actually trying to help each other to make those green transition, but by punishing them, but by giving them sanctions, which again where we explained how this would work, giving them sanctions, they will just stop collaborating because they will care more on reconstructing their economy after those sanctions has been implemented. And what about the countries that can't afford to not look at those sanctions? Those countries are mainly, they are like this because their economy is based on those non-renewable energy. And of course, they will invest in this because it's the more short-term solution that they have to pay those sanctions. So it will only create more pollution, meaning that in the proposition world, we will just stop being a cooperative society that actually care about the environment. And that's why we've never been proud to be opposition.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Proposition is like a thief who continues going to jail, but the government, instead of teaching him how to go back into society and getting a job, continue punishing him uselessly. Hi again, I'm Carlo Celletti, and in my reply, I have the honor of presenting the two worlds in this debate. And finally, we will explain the metaphor used as the first sentence in my speech. Let's start with the two worlds. In proposition world, they try an inefficient solution in which countries who have money to have money to survive these sanctions, just ignore them. And throughout this debate, opposition has brought the example again and again of Russia, and it has been ineffectively rebutted. And instead, countries in their world who don't have money have two solutions: or they decide to live in eternal poverty, or they pollute even more to boost their own industries. In their world, the world stops cooperating because they continue fighting each other, because no one is really respecting the Paris agreements. Everyone simply continues punishing and punishing and punishing each other, and nothing is really solved. In their world, everyone is more worse off than before, because the people are poor because of the sanctions, and they live under more pollution because they haven't solved anything in the end. Instead, and countries ruin their relations with other countries, because we talked about cooperation. In their world, countries have less money, especially if they want to do a transition. There is no money in their world. Instead, in our world, we finally have an effective solution in which, through incentives, countries have the tools to finally act. We work together in our world as a community to find feasible solutions. So each country, through the tools, can finally find a solution. In our world, each country helps in its own way. We recognize that poor countries can't do by their own the transition because they don't have the tools. And especially if we do what opposition's world is saying, by sanctioning them, we help them with our tools. So we can help them, so we finally have a positive action towards the green transition in all countries of the world. In our world, everyone is more better off, because people have more jobs thanks to the transition, because it creates jobs, and they live under less pollution. So we would have a better quality of life in general in our world. In our world, countries cooperate, exchanging experts between each other and also knowledge. Instead of punishing continuously each other, we find through cooperation effective solutions in our world. So now let's try and explain the metaphor I used. An average person who goes to jail for stealing because he lives in a bad condition, but now he is finally free. He goes out of jail, and there can be two reactions to this problem. In proposition world, the man will continue going back to jail because he doesn't know anything better, and the government will continue punishing him because in an ineffective way, without thinking of an effective solution, teaching him a job, teaching him to go back into society, demonstrating how punishment never works. Instead, in our world, we teach that man a job and how to reintegrate itself into society. In this way, we prioritize reintegration, helping each other to work through a common goal instead of useless punishment. In the same way, proposition throughout the debate has brought on sanctions that will just damage all the countries without finding effective solutions. Instead, our world brings on a world in which, through cooperation, we find a solution. We give tools to the countries that they don't have tools, so we can finally find a green transition. Because in the end, punishment doesn't give, it simply removes. Thank you very much for listening.
First of all, the flash. The first one being on the efficacy of sanctions and of findings as well. Opposition side denied how the whole debate the chance of using sanctions and stayed to the status quo, where anyways findings are given but are wasted. Proposition side proved instead that the status quo can be the solution because of the status quo climate change still isn't addressed enough. And on findings, we have to say that only on proposition side they can work, because proposition side proved that in the status quo findings don't work because there is no incentive for For the countries, the only way to work would be to have the incentive. Only on our side there is the incentive, so funding are helpful only on our side. Now, the second point, on collaboration. Our proposition said that collaboration is completely hard because countries end up in a territory war, but the opposition side proved it unlikely that a territory war happened because it harms every country. So if countries have another choice, they choose the other choice. And the proposition side also proved that the alternative is complying with the regulations, so countries are incentivized to do it. And the proposition side flipped their arguments with the rhetoric speaker that they got no rebuttals while we were debate and throughout the entire round. And the proposition side thought that the economies are interconnected. So if one is armed, the other is armed as well. So countries have the incentive also to collaborate more because they don't will bear the consequences of sanctions. Now, the third and I think the most important clash of this debate on what is fair. On opposition side, what isn't fair is just imposing sanctions. But on proposition side, what isn't fair is to remain exposed under the threat of climate change. So what weighs more is, of course, the threat of climate change. That side of opposition, it weighs more the threat of climate change than the unfairness of funding of punishment. So the unfairness of punishment is legitimate inside the position for the sake of survival. Now, with the comparison of the two words, on opposition side, opposition word, it's a word that believes itself to be fair and just, but it's a word that claims to want to have, that they want to solve the solution, but actually doesn't, because it remains in the status quo where the problem isn't addressed enough. Proposition side instead, it's a word that has really clear which its priorities are, and the priority is to tackle climate change. So that's the most fair thing to do, because it takes care of the most threatening issue of all time. So at the end of this round, the goal was to tackle climate change best, and we weigh on urgency more than anything else. So their comparative doesn't change anything for the developing nation, because their comparative is the status quo. So and it is not even exclusive to their side. So we incentivize and enforce, and that's why we should vote proposition.
Thank you for this debate.